In our last installment of the Book of Luke series, we reviewed the parable of the pounds, or the parable of the minas. We also covered Jesus fulfilling the prophecy of Zechariah 9:9 by riding a young donkey as he approached Jerusalem for the final time in the flesh. His driving the money changers out of the temple courts, the religious leaders questioning Jesus about the source of his authority, and then, of course, the parable of the wicked vine dressers. We concluded last time with the chief priests and the scribes wanting to arrest Jesus after realizing that they were the focus of the wicked vine dressers in the parable. But they were afraid to do so due to the popularity of Jesus among the masses. So that brings us then to verse 20 of chapter 20 of the book of Luke. So they watched him and sent spies who pretended to be righteous, or pretended to be sincere, as some translations have, that they might seize on his words, or as the New American Standard has, that they might catch him in some statement, in order, or the Revised English Bible, that they could use as a pretext to deliver him to the power and authority of the governor. Matthew's account identified the spies as disciples and actually the acting proxies of the Pharisees who had earlier confronted Jesus, which we were not going to go back and review at this time. And those Pharisees sent these spies so that Jesus would not be suspicious of their plot. They didn't come themselves. They sent their proxies. And that way, they would be hidden behind their proxies. Now, Mark also, his account, joins Matthew in adding that they were accompanied by the Herodians. Luke leaves that particular tidbit of information out. And that was, as we've covered before, a very abnormal alliance due to the difference in their philosophical points of view. The Herodians, remember, were loyal to the family of Herod, and therefore very supportive of the Romans who had given the Herods their authority all the way back into the days of Herod the Great. The Pharisees, on the other hand, desired a free Jewish nation, a free Jewish state, which led them to normally detest the Herodians because they were on the opposite end of the spectrum to them. However, their plot required interaction if they were to succeed in pulling the wool over Jesus' eyes. So either both groups had devised this trap that follows together, or more likely, the Pharisees had engaged purposely some of the Herodians in an argument about Roman taxation with the intention of drawing Jesus into their carefully laid trap. Now, only Luke points out here in verse 20 just how devious they were. They sent spies. They were insidious in what they were trying to do. Verse 21, then they asked him, saying, Teacher, we know that you say and teach rightly, and you do not show personal favoritism, or as the New Living Translation has, that you are not influenced by what others think, but teach the way of God truly or honestly, as Moffat translates it here. The spies, very clearly here, used flattery to try and convince Jesus that they were sincere men who only wanted and who only desired to know what he believed the Scriptures, what the Holy Scriptures taught concerning the question of taxation, as they go on to say in verse 22. Is it lawful for us to pay taxes to Caesar or not? Is it lawful? Based upon what the Holy Scriptures say, is it a lawful practice? Now, they attempted to appear utterly sincere as they posed this question in an attempt to lure him into their insidious trap. If he declared that Caesar had no right to tax him, the Herodians would immediately run off and report him to the Roman governor for inciting rebellion against Rome, for withholding what was Rome's due. If he indicated that Caesar did have the right to tax them, the Pharisees knew he would immediately alienate the common people that they were so fearful of losing influence over, because the people, the common people, believed that it was indeed wrong to pay tax to a foreign ruler, because doing so was an insult to God. And then, on top of all of that, they would turn on Jesus. Because, why? If he were the Messiah, why would he support paying a tax to an empire that he was just about to overthrow? Didn't make any sense. So, they thought they had him. Verse 23, but he perceived their craftiness, or he perceived their trickery, and said to them, why do you test me? Since he was always aware of the thoughts of all who were around him, remember the Pharisee who had invited him to his dinner, he knew exactly what he was thinking, and other situations and other accounts, but back in chapter 5 of Luke, we have one of those examples. He knew what was going, he knew what people were thinking all the time, and so he knew already about their deceit. He knew about the plot that they were trying to foist on him. So he said in verse 24, show me a denarius, or show me a coin, many translations have, whose image or whose portrait and inscription or title, different translations have, does it have? They answered and said, Caesar's. The coin's image would have been that of the current emperor, which at that time was Tiberius. Tiberius Caesar would have been the face on the coin. On the front of the coin was his portrait with his name. Okay? Coin, picture of the guy, and his name. And on the reverse side, to flip it over, it said that he's the Caesar, and he's identified as the Pontifex Maximus, the high priest of the religion of the Roman Empire. That's what was on the coin. So everything about the coin was Caesar. Everything was about Caesar, whether the front or the back. And he said to them in verse 25, render therefore to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. So we find that Jesus made them responsible to answer their own question. Whose image is on the coin? Who does the coin belong to? You know, a coin is a token of worth, intrinsically useless and valuable only because other people are willing to exchange either goods or services or both for that coin. They have trust in the value of the coin. By virtue of the likeness and the name of Caesar on the coin itself belonged to Caesar. It's like putting your name inside your Bible or inside of a book. This is my book. Well, the coin's got his picture and his name on it. It's his coin. So if he should ask for someone to give him the coin that belonged to him, he should immediately do whatever was required. Caesar should be obeyed when he required whatever tax was due to him. And so God should also, as he says, give things to Caesar that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. So God should receive whatever is due to him. And what's due to God? Obedience to God's commands. And some of God's commands is tithe and give offerings. So certain things do belong to God. Now, as Peter and the other apostles later brought out back in Acts chapter 5, anytime a conflict arises between what a human government demands and what God requires, God's requirements must always precede the demands of a human government. But in this case, Caesar has the right. It's his coin. You got to give it to him if he asks for it. Verse 26. But they could not catch him in his words, or complete Jewish Bible, they could not trap him by anything he said in the presence of the people. And they marveled at his answer and kept silent. The spies were absolutely amazed because they believed that they had the perfect trap. There is no way to get out of this. No matter how you answer it, You're going to incriminate yourself with one group or the other. You're going to offend somebody. No possible way to escape, and yet he did. And he did so with an answer that totally baffled them. It just, how could he come up? Again, this is God. This is Yahweh from the Old Testament. He created all things, the human mind. There's no way you'll ever get him in a trap. You can't do it. But of course, they didn't believe that he was God either. But nonetheless, he did, and he did so in just a spectacular way. Now, Matthew's account reveals that once this happened, the Herodians and these Pharisees, or the spies of the Pharisees, they took off, they left, obviously because they had no other trap any better than the one that Jesus had instantly demolished right here and there. We don't have anything better. We don't have anything in the bullpen we can bring out here. That was our best shot. And so they left. Then, verse 27, Goodspeed has, then some of the Sadducees who say that there is no resurrection came up and asked him. Now, according to Josephus, the Sadducees believed that the books of Moses were the only authoritative source for doctrine or teaching of truth. That's found back in Josephus' Antiquities of the Jews. And since there was no direct mention of a resurrection from the dead within Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, or Deuteronomy, they believed, then they rejected the belief in a resurrection. From what little is mentioned about the Sadducees in the New Testament and what Josephus tells us in Antiquities of the Jews, that belief and their rejection of the existence of angels or spirits seem to be the major contentions between them and the Pharisees. The Apostle Paul, back in Acts chapter 23, used the fact that there was this real rub between the Pharisees and the Sadducees over the resurrection. He brought it up so that they started fighting among themselves and left him alone. But this was, again, one of their primary beliefs. These Sadducees evidently believed that even though the spies of the Pharisees had failed miserably in trapping Jesus, that they could succeed by ridiculing him. And they would do so by posing a question that they believed could not be answered from the books of Moses. No way he can turn this around. We've studied it. We've gone back and forth. We know exactly how it is. Verse 28, saying, they came and asked him, saying, Teacher, Moses wrote to us that if a man's brother dies, having a wife, and he dies without children, his brother should take his wife and raise up offspring for his brother. Now, the basis of the Sadducees' question was the instruction concerning levirate marriages, back in Deuteronomy chapter 25, which were commanded by God in the days when Israel, the tribes, had certain partitions of land, and that land stayed within the tribes forever, is the way it was supposed to be, unless they got kicked out of the land, which they did, as we know. But they were commanded to make these marriages so that the dead brother's name and his legal rights could be preserved for the sake of his family. And so that was the reason for the levirate marriage instructions. Verse 29. Now, there were 7 brothers. The first took a wife and died without children. The second took her as wife, and he died childless. Then the third took her, and in like manner the 7 also, all the way down to the last one. And they left no children and died. Last of all, the woman died also. Therefore, in the resurrection, which we don't really believe in, whose wife does she become? For all 7 had her as wife. The Sadducees believed by this question that they had proven the audacity, absurdity of the idea of a resurrection. How could one woman be resurrected to be the wife of 7 husbands all at the same time? There was no evidence in the books of Moses that God would approve any such polygamous or incestuous arrangement. Can't find it. Now, Luke omits the preface to Jesus' answer that's given in Matthew's account that included this statement. Matthew and Mark both make it. Jesus, before he answered, said, "You are mistaken." Luke drops it out. Luke doesn't put it. "You are mistaken regarding your question, not knowing the Scriptures nor the power of God." Jesus told them that there were two reasons for their faulty conclusion and the far-fetched, erroneous example that they had used in their question to mock the reality of the resurrection. First of all, because of their refusal to accept not only the law division, the books of Moses, but the prophets division and the writings division. All of the prophets, because they rejected using that for the formulation of doctrine or teaching, that is the trunk of the tree. Because of that, because they rejected that extra revelation, they were ignorant of the full revelation of God that is provided through the Holy Scriptures. Because the prophets and the law and the writings build on the law. So it's an extension of the law. It helps to understand how the law is to be applied. But the Sadducees just threw it out. Now, had they accepted these other two divisions of the prophets and the writings, the truth and the understanding of the reality of the resurrection would prove absolutely that they had no question. They would never have had to formulate and fabricate such an absolutely ridiculous question. Secondly, by rejecting the resurrection, they indicated they had no concept in the power of God. Since they had access to God's revelation, it was inexcusable for them to believe what they believed, the fact that there is no resurrection. Now, my personal take on this is that, we don't have any definitive, the Sadducees believe thus and such, but based upon the fact that many of the Jews down in Alexandria, Egypt, accepted the pagan doctrine, the pagan teaching that came from the Babylonian mystery religions and all the other, they had accepted the immortal soul teaching. And so I think that the Sadducees must have believed that, and they're more logical than the Christian world. Everybody's got an immortal soul, and so after death, you're either going down there or you're going up here. And of course, there used to be this somewhere in between purgatory thing, which I think one pope said, no, that really doesn't hold water anymore. But nonetheless, but then they talk about a resurrection. What? If you already have life, why do you have another resurrection? And of course, that's a mystery. Why there's this resurrection, but apparently the Sadducees must have believed in an immortal soul, so there's no need for a resurrection. You're going to either go down to the Sheol and be there with all the bad people all the time, or you're going to do whatever. That's what I think, because it doesn't make sense that they would reject the resurrection and reject that there's anything beyond this life. What are they wasting their time, doing what they were doing? But one of these days we'll find out. But at this point, nobody really knows what the Sadducees believe. They didn't believe in a resurrection, doesn't say they didn't believe in an afterlife, but they did not believe in a resurrection. They didn't believe in angels or spirits, but they obviously believed in a realm of spirit. Anyway, we'll move on. Verse 34, "And Jesus answered and said to them, the sons of," or the New Revised Standard, "those who belong to this age marry and are given in marriage." Now, this age refers to the time allotted for physical life, during which God has set apart 3 distinct periods of judgment for salvation. That is, for all of mankind. All of mankind will eventually be offered salvation. Nobody's lost out on the opportunity other than people who may have already been given the opportunity and turned away from it. God established the marriage institution for this age, the physical age, and provided it to man in the form of a covenant back there in Genesis chapter 2. God stipulates that a man and woman who enter into that covenant are bound to each other to become one flesh or one unit until either one of them dies. One dies, the bond is broken, ending the marriage, according to what Paul writes back in Romans chapter 7. Even the levirate marriage law that the Sadducees used from the book of Deuteronomy as the basis of their question required that death end the marriage bond. Otherwise, the brother who marries his brother's widow would be committing incest according to the law back in Leviticus chapter 18. Verse 35, but those who are counted or judged worthy to attain that age, or as the Complete Jewish Bible specifies, the age to come, and the resurrection from the dead, neither marry nor are given in marriage, nor can they die anymore. Now, the age to come refers to eternity with God, all within the realm of spirit. Those who choose to totally surrender themselves to God and be led by the Spirit of God, Paul tells us back in Romans chapter 8, verse 14, that they are the children of God, already considered the children of God. And they will receive eternal life as His immortal children, never again susceptible to death, either the first death or the second death, because they will not be physical. Once they're immortal, they're not physical, they're not subject to death. Verse 36 goes on, for they are equal to the angels, or they are like angels, some translations have, and are sons, or as the King James has, they are children of God. Being sons, or being the children, again from the King James, the children of the resurrection. The accounts of both Matthew and Mark clearly state that the relationship of angels to those who are resurrected into the age to come is that, like the angels, as he says here in the latter part, verse 36, who do not marry, there will be no marriage between the children of God. That's what he's saying here. One reason God created the marriage institution was to provide a stable, balanced environment for human children that would be produced by a husband and wife, a male and a female. Okay, so that anybody that may be listening somewhere thinks I mean two of the same gender, being male and female, like we see in so many stupid commercials today. But no. A male and a female. That's what it says. That's the only way you can get a marriage. And if anybody believes that's hate speech, then go see God. Talk to God about it. All right. Now, in the spirit realm, that is, of the kingdom of God, the only reproduction that occurs is when men and women are resurrected and changed and then enter into the realm of spirit as immortal children of God. They will then be the children of God, as the angels are also called the sons or the children of God, back in Job chapter 1. That is, like the angels, they will not reproduce. Okay? They don't marry, they don't reproduce. They will have no need to be married to one another in order to become one unit. Instead, they will be joined to God, the Father and Jesus Christ, and made one with the Father and the Son, as Jesus brings out very clearly back in John chapter 17. Verse 37. Now, even Moses showed in the burning bush passage that the dead are raised when he called the Lord the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. After addressing the ignorance of the Sadducees for projecting the physical institution of marriage established by God for this current physical material age, by projecting that into the spirit realm of the age to come, Jesus now focuses on their ignorance in refusing to believe that the dead will be resurrected. Now, since the Sadducees insisted on basing all doctrine solely from the 5 books of Moses, the law division of the Holy Scriptures, they refused to accept any references to the resurrection that occurs in either the writings or the prophets' divisions. Therefore, Jesus quoted a passage here because of their stipulation. It's got to come from the books of Moses, so he quotes here a passage that they had overlooked. Went right over their heads. They didn't understand it as clearly as he made it here from the 2nd book of Moses in Exodus chapter 3. And he uses this, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And he uses this to show them the error that they had made in concluding that there is no mention of the resurrection in the law division. For, verse 38, he is not the God of the dead, or he's not the God of dead men, Goodspeed has, but of the living. For all live, or all are alive, New Revised Standard, to him. Since God claimed to be the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, long after they had all died, then God was referring to a condition of conscious life that would exist again. No question in God's mind. To God, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, well, they're just now sleeping. They're in bed, temporarily unconscious until they hear the voice of the Son of God that will awaken them at the time of their resurrection. You know, Jesus says back in John 5 that all who are in the grave are going to hear his voice. Now, not necessarily at the same time, as he goes on to show, because there's an earlier time and then there's a later time, a white throne judgment, when they will hear his voice. Verse 39, then some of the scribes answered and said, Teacher, you have spoken well. The scribes who commended Jesus could have been either Pharisees or possibly even Sadducees, or both. Matthew records that the multitudes, consisting of the very large crowd that was actually present that day, as well as the vast number of Jewish pilgrims in Jerusalem who heard about this particular event secondhand because they weren't actually there, they were all astonished at his explanation of this. They had never heard it before. Well, the religious leaders had never seen it before, but now it had been proven. Verse 40, but after that, they dared not question him anymore. The Sadducees' attempt to discredit or embarrass Jesus backfired. And again, they were totally ignorant concerning the confinement of the institution of marriage to the present age. And so, their ignorance, and then he followed that by his proof of the resurrection of the dead from the books of Moses, so they really had mud all over their faces. And they had no desire to engage him on anything anymore. However, according to the accounts of Matthew and Mark, there was a group of Pharisees who came to Jesus, and one of them, who was a Pharisee who was a scribe, who was very impressed with how Jesus handled the Sadducees' question, how he had applied Scripture from the book of Exodus, of all things, he asked him which was the most important commandment in the law. Now again, that's recorded in Matthew and Mark's account, but Luke omits that passage. But like Matthew and Mark's account, he does include what immediately followed that particular event, going on here in verse 41. Because after that question was answered of that scribe, then Jesus himself posed a question. And he said to them, verse 41, how can they say that the Christ, or the Messiah, as some translations have, is David's son. Now, Matthew prefaces this question that Jesus asked. He prefaced this question with Jesus asking the Pharisees about the descent of the Messiah and their response that the Messiah was a descendant of David. That's the first thing he did, is he asked them, well, whose son is he? And then they came back and answered. Mark adds that this occurred while Jesus was teaching in the temple courts. After posing this question, Jesus goes on to give his reason for asking it. All right, so Luke's got it a little different the way he recorded the actual event. Verse 42, now David himself said in the book of Psalms, Jesus is explaining this because nobody would speak up, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand till I make your enemies your footstool. Verse 44, the New Revised Standard has, thus David thus calls him Lord, which means master. So how can he, the Messiah, be David's son? How is that possible? By quoting Psalm 110, and this is the first verse from Psalm 110, Jesus drew attention to the fact that David, under divine inspiration, was shown that the Messiah was to be his Lord or his master, which indicated that the Messiah possessed greater authority than David did. So, since a father possesses greater authority than his son, yet the Messiah possessed greater authority than David, Jesus asked them, how is this possible for the Messiah to be David's son or David's descendant? How is this possible? Again, they couldn't answer. Now, Matthew's account states that no one, absolutely no one, even ventured to give any kind of a reply. Their understanding was limited to believing that the Messiah was only a mortal being who had descent only from David, a man who had been established to be king of Israel by God, which meant that David's authority came directly from God. God made him king. And so all of David's authority was right from God. So how is it that David's not going to be in greater authority than the Messiah? Well, since the Messiah, who descended from David, had authority over David, that authority had to come not from David, but directly from God, over David's head, if you will, which meant that the Messiah was more than a human descendant of David. He must also descend directly from God. That's what it meant. And of course, they could not grasp that, because that is not what the Messiah was according to the way they interpreted the Scriptures. Verse 45, then, in the hearing of all the people, he said to his disciples, in response to the silence of the Pharisees after he posed this question, Jesus continued speaking in their presence, but loudly enough for all who were in the temple courts to hear. So maybe he was up over on Solomon's colonnade up above the people so that everybody there could hear what he was saying. But he was obviously speaking with a pretty powerful voice in order to be heard in such a large area with all of these bodies. It was packed with people. And so, first thing he says, beware of the scribes. Now, in Matthew's account, Jesus also includes the Pharisees among the scribes, among those whom the people should not blindly follow, even though they had seated themselves in Moses' seat, which Luke doesn't bring out. Now, Moses' seat was the position of being judge over the people. He told the people that they should accept whatever judgments the scribes and the Pharisees made, or whatever they rendered, in settling disputes or setting compensation because of losses or whatever, in the same way that God's people are expected to obey worldly governments, like the Apostle Paul brings out back in Romans chapter 13. However, since Jesus had warned his disciples earlier to avoid following the false doctrines, the leaven of the scribes and Pharisees, or the Pharisees and the Sadducees, rather. The focus of his warning at this time was much the same. The people were not to blindly accept and follow their corrupt religious teachings and hypocritical examples, as he goes on now to explain. Now, again, Matthew gives us a lot more information in Matthew chapter 23. Luke has already gotten into some of this a little earlier. We covered earlier. But Luke gives us part of what's in Matthew 24, but he doesn't give it in the same way. All right, verse 46 continues, who desire to go around in long robes, love greetings in the marketplaces, the best seats in the synagogues, and the best places at feasts, or the best places at banquets. Matthew begins this list of the religious leaders' practices by stating, if you go back to Matthew 23, he said, all their works they do to be seen by men. It's not because of God is watching, it's we want to impress men. That's why they did what they did. Verse 47, New Living Translation has, yet they shamelessly cheat widows out of their property. They try to appear righteous. Now, you don't find here where Luke says scribes, Pharisees, hypocrites like Matthew does. He leaves that out, but very obviously he's talking about their hypocrisy here. Oh, they want to give people the impression of their great religious belief and their religious practices and so on, but they shamelessly cheat widows out of their property. Now, since men who claim to serve God were trusted, that's generally the way it is. I mean, you got people like Benny Hinn, and you got all these other flakes out here that, promise, I'll send you a bag of this holy water from the Jordan River, and, if you'll just take this and I don't know what you do with it, sprinkle you're going to come into a lot of money. And people will send them all kinds of money to get this little bag of something that came out of a faucet somewhere, but they trust this guy. Well, he's religious. Look how many people have been duped by religion over the years. One reason that a lot of religion's been rejected in this world is because of these shysters, a lot of them. But beyond that, again, people want to trust them. They want to trust them. Well, they're supposedly close to God, so, you can surely trust them if they're close to God. Well, they were, as a result, because of that, the scribes were often appointed to be executors of men's wills to ensure that the widows of those men would be properly taken care of. Yet both scribes and Pharisees, according to Matthew's account, were in the habit of, taking a little bit, should be taking maybe a little bit to cover certain costs, like lawyers. Scribes, remember, means lawyer. But instead, they were in the habit of taking way too much of the inheritance of these widows for themselves, leaving the widows with very little to survive on. They shamelessly did this, according to Jesus, despite God's promise back in Exodus 22 to deal death to those who take advantage of a widow or an orphan. Verse 47 continues in the New Living Translation. And then, after they cheat widows out of their property, then pretend to be pious by making long prayers in public. Because of this, they will be severely punished, or the New King James, they will receive greater condemnation. Jesus referred to their hypocritical reasons for praying at the time that he presented the Sermon on the Mount, when he described how they loved to pray while everyone in the synagogues were watching, while people out on the street, they'd go to the street corners to pray in public places, so the people would watch them and be impressed by the words that they said. Oh, those glorious words. Oh, that man is so religious. Listen to how he's talking to God. Jesus said, you don't do that. Their prayers were not focused on building and nurturing a relationship with God between them and God. No. Their prayers were only for the purpose of impressing others. And such prayers God condemns to be abominations back in Proverbs. Chapter 21, verse 1. And he looked up and saw the rich putting their gifts into the treasury, or probably better translated in the complete Jewish Bible as the temple offering boxes. Temple offering boxes. The treasury, as it's called here, actually consisted of 13 trumpet-shaped metal offering boxes. They were chests, and they kind of went up and wide, and that way whatever went in, nobody could get their hands down there and take it out, you know. It was trumpet-shaped. And so there were 13 of them that were placed in the temple court, probably the women's court, so everybody had access to it there. Each one was marked with a different letter of the Hebrew alphabet. Now, I've never been able to find out why. Maybe each one was identified for each of the 12 tribes, plus we got Joseph being Ephraim and Manasseh. Maybe that's it. But that doesn't make sense because the Levites did have to tithe. At any rate, I only know that there were 13 of them, and each one with a separate letter of the Hebrew alphabet. And people came to the temple, and everybody had to pay the temple tax. So the temple tax went into those, and then, of course, there were people who brought other monetary gifts, or they could bring tithes that were, of course, coins. You didn't bring your lamb or your dove and try to stick it into the offering box. The animals, they were given somewhere else. But, if it was coinage, if it was precious metal, then it went into those boxes. Now, since their composition was metal, they were made out of metal, every donation was accompanied by sound. Everything was thrown in, you could hear because it was made out of metal. And of course, the larger the number of coins, the louder the trumpet sounded. Now, this may have been the basis of Jesus' caution back in the Sermon on the Mount about not sounding a trumpet while doing charitable deeds. Okay, that makes a lot more sense. Many of the rich waited for large crowds to assemble in the temple courts before they made their donations because they wanted to impress everybody. The more you give, obviously, the more religious you are. But that was a problem. All right, so he looked up, he saw the rich putting their gifts in, and he saw, verse 2, also a certain poor widow putting in 2 mites, or 2 small copper coins, several other translations have. Verse 3, the New International goes on. Jesus says, I tell you the truth, he said, this poor widow has put in more than all the others. Now, looking at it, she's put in far less than everybody else. Jesus says, no, she's put in more than all the others. All these people gave their gifts or their offerings for God, as the New King James has, out of their wealth. They have lots and lots of it. But she, out of her poverty, put in all she had to live on. Jesus knew exactly. She had nothing else. That was all she had left, and she put it in. Most of those people that were assembled in the temple courts looked toward the treasury or the offering boxes whenever they heard a loud sound that came from one of those metal boxes, being greatly impressed by the individual who stood there, who were throwing all these coins and whatever in. Few, if any of them, paid any attention to the poor widow, because as small as those, if you've seen the widow's mite, not very big, probably think, well, it must have been a bug. A beetle must have landed on the thing because I can't even hear it. Yet she was the most generous of all because of her selfless spirit. That's what Jesus said. Verse 5, Complete Jewish Bible has, as some people were remarking about the temple, how beautiful its stonework and memorial decorations were, he said, now according to Mark's account, one of the disciples made this remark as they were getting ready to leave the temple courts. That's in Mark 13. Matthew's account reveals that others joined in, other disciples joined in asking the question after they had left the temple area. That's again in the first part of Matthew chapter 24. And so the question came up not once but several times. Verse 6, "As for these things which you see, the days will come in which not one stone shall be left upon another, that shall not be thrown down." This was Jesus' response to their adoration of the very impressive architecture of the temple complex, as they, again, were in the process of leaving Jerusalem, going back out, probably over to Bethany to spend the night. He emphasized that despite its incredible beauty and luxury and the enormity of the temple foundation itself, those foundation stones were incredibly huge and massive. Despite all of that, the structure they admired, the structure that looked absolutely permanent, like it would be there forever and ever and ever, would in the future, Jesus said, be totally destroyed. Again, not one stone that shall not be thrown down. We don't have that yet. There's still stones that are still standing there that were laid time of Herod the Great. Haven't moved. Still there. And they ask him, saying, verse 7, "Teacher, but when will these things be? And what sign will there be when these things are about to take place?" According to Mark's account, it was not until later that Jesus sat down on the Mount of Olives. It wasn't as they were leaving that he made this statement. No. It was later, Jesus sat down on the Mount of Olives, and he was privately asked this question, or these questions, or similar questions in Matthew's account and Mark's account, by Peter, James, John, and Andrew. So there's only 4 of them that asked. It wasn't all 12, but 4 of them asked questions. The focus of their question, or questions, is the same in both Luke and Mark. They're identical. They wanted to know when the destruction of the temple complex would occur. However, in Matthew's account, the second question concerns the sign of Jesus' return and the end of the age, which is not here as we see in verse 7. Because that will also be the same time that the conclusion of the destruction of the temple area will take place. Temple area, part of it was massively destroyed in 70 A.D. or A.D. 70. But there's still stuff that's still stone on stone. Hasn't happened yet. The conclusion, though, of events will be at Christ's return. Now, since Jesus is answering questions that were posed privately by his disciples, by those who were in the know, if you will, it's essential to remember that his answer is intended specifically for his disciples, not for the world at large. His discourse includes vital information that can be understood only by those individuals who have been selected by the Father and who have received the gift of the Holy Spirit. Then they can begin to put this together and put it together with other parts of the Holy Scripture to have a more full understanding. So what follows as we go on in verse 8 is generally referred to as, again, the Olivet prophecy, whether here or Mark 13 or Matthew 24. It can be viewed in a number of ways, as we've covered before, including how it will impact these events, how it will impact the whole world, the world at large, or how it would affect the disciples who lived in the first century, because there are things here that did affect them, and how it will apply to the disciples of Jesus who live at the very close of the age, which again, is always our primary focus when we look at this material, because we want the focus on what is going to apply to us. How's this going to affect us? So, verse 8, "And he said," okay, in response to the question, "Take heed that you be not deceived," or be not led astray. The New New Revised Standard has. The first warning Jesus gives us is to always stay alert to the possibility of deception. Don't ever think that you can be immune to deception, because no, there are a lot of people who have fallen to deception. There was a guy one time over here at the Opera House, stood up in a cocky way and said, "Brethren, you cannot be deceived." The liar was deceived himself and deceived others. Why, we were closet Trinitarians, he went on to say. You know, what a bold thing to say. He was a deceiver. Of course a deceiver is going to tell you you can't be deceived. Satan's going to try to pawn that one off on you. So Jesus right up front says the first thing you need to consider, don't let anybody lead you astray. You better stay really close to God. God's got to come first, not what some man says, not what some human reasoning idea is. The Word's got to come first. 4, he goes on to say, many will come in my name saying, I am he. Or, again, it just is I am. The translators interject here, he, which, again, that makes sense. King James says, I am Christ, or other translations, I am the Messiah. But I am he. And the time has drawn near. The time has come. This is what they're going to say. Therefore, do not go after them. Or Goodspeed, do not follow after them. The New Living Translation, do not believe them, Jesus says. The core of this warning pertains to the influence that would be exerted by the Babylonian mystery religions after they would adopt the name of Jesus to use in place of the names of their false gods, like Mithra, you know, the god of the Roman army. That's who was worshipped so much in the first century. They would claim to represent him, but would actually teach another Jesus, a different Jesus, as the Apostle Paul refers to back in 2 Corinthians 11. If they come and preach a different doctrine or different Jesus or have a different spirit, don't listen to them, Paul warned. The Jesus that they teach bears no resemblance to the true Savior, whose life and teachings were being seen at that time and heard by the apostles themselves and would later be recorded by the apostles. They were taking all of this in and then they would record it. Such deceivers would come promoting a counterfeit Christ, Jesus warns here. Jesus' first warning is directly connected to the event portrayed after the opening of the first seal of John's vision back here in Revelation chapter 6. In Revelation chapter 6, hold your place in Luke. We're just going to look at a couple of verses here, just as reminders. Revelation 6:2, John says, and I looked, and behold, a white horse, and he who sat on it had a bow, and a crown was given to him, and he went out conquering and to conquer. Now, as we've covered before, the color white represents purity, a trait that evokes trust, which leads people to believe whatever the rider of this horse is proclaiming. Well, he's dressed in white. We need to listen to what he has to say. The crown stands for the rulership over the earth, rulership that Satan the devil has possessed since Adam surrendered dominion of the earth to him when he disobeyed God. He went ahead and disobeyed God. Adam, don't touch that tree, don't take of its fruit, don't eat it, and he did. And so he disobeyed God, and Satan has been in charge of the dominion of the earth ever since. The bow symbolizes Satan's ongoing attacks on mankind in order to keep all people deceived. And everybody's deceived. Even here in Revelation chapter 12, verse 9, all have been deceived. There's no exception. No exception. Since Satan has deceived the whole world, all of the religions created by man have been false and have been promoted by Satan the devil. Therefore, the white horse of the first seal in Revelation represents the veil of deception that its rider, the devil, has spread over all of humanity. Wherever you look in the world today. Yes, Islam is included in that. Hinduism is included. It doesn't matter what the religion is, everyone has been tainted by Satan the devil. Again, hold your place here in Revelation. We'll go back and look, chapter 21, verse 9 of Luke. But when you hear of wars and commotions, or some translations have wars and revolutions. Wars, rumors of wars, as Matthew brings out in his account, and revolutions are all directly connected to the action of the rider of the red horse in the second seal, back here in Revelation chapter 6. So let's note this in Revelation 6, verse 3. When he opened the second seal, I heard the second living creature saying, "Come and see." And another horse, fiery red, went out, and it was granted to the one who sat on it to take peace from the earth, and that people should kill one another. And there was given to him a great sword. Now this rider prevents peace on earth, that's what it says, by using his great sword to divide. And he divides families. He divides neighbors. He divides nations throughout the world. Satan initiates all division by creating suspicion and planting doubts in the minds of men. And of course, those suspicions and doubts lead to resentment. They lead to hatred. And then hatred brings about the eruption of war. Because men will eventually surrender to their bitterness. They will surrender to their hatred. And they will, as it says here in verse 4, they will kill one another. And of course, first person that was murdered was Abel. Number 4 in human history. Fourth individual. Second one born, but the fourth that we read about from the beginning of civilization was murdered. Interesting, 1 out of 4. In verse 9, again, of chapter 21, do not be terrified, do not panic, for these things must pass first. But the end will not come immediately. Despite the global scope of these first two conditions of deception and division, which have been inevitable due to the dominion of the earth that Satan has possessed since Adam, there are not signs, these are not signs, signaling the immediate end of the age. It's been going on for almost 6,000 years. All right, verse 10. Then he said to them, nation will rise against nation, or the Revised English Bible, nation will go to war against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. Complete Jewish Bible simply has, peoples will fight each other. Nations will fight each other. And we see that going on almost every time we turn on the news. People fighting people. Satan is a divider. And he's done a good job in the last few years of really dividing this country, United States of America. United States? Divided states. How about that? Because that's the truth of it right now. It's the divided states. But, again, nobody wants to admit Satan has any power. They don't even believe any. Are you kidding? And there will be great earthquakes, or severe earthquakes, some translations have, in various places, and famines and pestilences, and instead of pestilences, the New Revised Standard has plagues. Complete Jewish Bible, epidemics. In addition to the revolutions and world wars and rumors of other conflicts, other major events would occur in many places on the earth, ultimately afflicting all of mankind. Famines and pestilences are linked directly to the activity, back here in Revelation chapter 6, verses 5 and 6, of the rider of the black horse, signified by the third opening of the third seal. Note here in verse 5, I'll read from the New International Translation, when the Lamb opened the third seal, I heard the third living creature say, "Come." I looked, And there before me was a black horse. Its rider was holding a pair of scales in his hand. Then I heard what sounded like a voice among the four living creatures, saying, "A quart of wheat for a day's wages, and 3 quarts of barley for a day's wages, and do not damage the oil and the wine." Now, black is the color used to describe despair and hopelessness. You know, you remember the Les Mis, black and red, and the song that they sang? Right there, they're talking about the despair, the hopelessness, the black, the red being the war. And they're talking about at least 2 of the 4 horses back here in Revelation. Anyway, it is hopeless, despair that black represents, which again are the mental states found in people who are suffering from scarcity, from serious diseases and destruction, whether the destruction comes from famines, whether it comes from floods, tornadoes, hurricanes, earthquakes, or other natural disasters, as we call them. There's still hopelessness. You turn on the Weather Channel and you watch these people whose houses have been absolutely demolished, obliterated from a tornado. And they are just, we've lost everything. It's hopeless. Therefore, the activity of the rider of the black horse symbolizes the destruction that Satan brings on all of humanity by manipulating the weather or inflicting plagues and so forth and so on. We know he does that from the book of Job. But he does it within the limits that God sets for him. In combination with the actions of the rider of the white, red, and black horses is the power of the rider here in verses 7 and 8 of the pale horse of the 4th seal. Let's note this, verse 7. When he opened the 4th seal, I heard the voice of the 4th living creature saying, "Come and see." So I looked, and behold, a pale horse. The name of him who sat on it was Death, and Hades followed with him. And power was given to them over 1/4 of the earth to kill with sword, with hunger, with death, and by the beasts of the earth. 1 and 4, just like Adam, Eve, Cain, and Abel. 1 and 4, been that way. The rider of the pale gray horse is responsible for spreading untimely death throughout all of the inhabitants of the earth. Hades, mentioned here, which simply means the grave as it's directly translated in the English, the grave provides a place for the bodies of the dead. That's what the grave is for. Due to the restraints that God has put on him, Satan, who is the rider of every one of the 4 horses, is currently limited to causing the premature deaths of no more than 1/4 of the earth's population. Now, at this point in the Olivet prophecy, going back to Luke 21, Matthew and Mark record at this point Jesus summarizing the coming of a counterfeit Christianity. Wars, famines, disease epidemics, earthquakes, and so on. He defines them again as the beginning of sorrows, because they began way back at the very outset of humanity, and they are still with us to this day. It's just the beginning of sorrows. You can't point to any one of these things and say, okay, this is it. They are destructive forces that have afflicted mankind for his whole history. Therefore, Jesus cautions his disciples against using any of them to gauge the nearness of the time of the end. Verse 11 goes on. And there will be fearful sights, or terrifying sights, some translations have, and great signs from heaven or from the sky, again, as other translations bring out. Only Luke includes that the heavenly signs of the 6th seal must precede the end of the age. Matthew and Mark don't mention it, but he does. It's also possible that the term fearful sights may also refer to the coming of the false prophet who calls fire down from heaven, because that's going to be terrifying. It's going to catch people's attention, remember? That's one of the first things that's going to happen once Satan is cast down. Now, the following 8 verses, beginning in verse 12, loosely parallel instruction that Jesus gave the apostles when he first told them about their future responsibilities back in Matthew chapter 10. Either Jesus repeated his earlier instruction here or Luke inserted it here based on the topic of tribulation that Jesus covered in the Olivet prophecy a lot more extensively later on in this chapter. All right, so verse 12. But before all these things, they will lay their hands on you, or they will arrest you, and persecute you, delivering you up to the synagogues and prisons, and you will be brought before kings and rulers for my name's sake, or for your allegiance to me, or because you are my followers, different translations have. Before the appearance of the heavenly signs of the 6th seal must come the fulfillment of the 5th seal that's recorded in Revelation chapter 6, verses 9 through 11. There's the 5th seal. Now, this is what we're talking about, tribulation, the 5th seal. Tribulation on both the disciples of Jesus Christ and on the Jews living in the land of Israel at the end time. It is the disciples of Jesus Christ that are first addressed here in verses 12 through 21. Then we'll pick up the Jews living in the land of Israel at this time. Based on disciples being delivered to the synagogues to be persecuted, this passage seems to require that its fulfillment was to be applied to the original disciples who lived in the first century. It makes sense there. But to be delivered up to synagogues today makes no sense. However, Jesus also indicated that a later time of persecution of his disciples would also precede the heavenly signs at the close of the age. Again, Revelation 6, verses 9 through 11. You must be killed. Some of you must be killed as were former servants. And so you got to wait. Remember the souls under the altar that are, okay, when are you going to avenge our blood? You got to wait, because there's going to be another period of tribulation, another period of martyrdom. And that's yet ahead of us. Verse 13, New Revised Standard has, this will give you an opportunity, that is, when you're brought before the synagogues and before kings and so forth, this will give you an opportunity to testify or to bear witness, other translations have. Luke records several of these testimonies in the book of Acts. We have Peter and John who testified before the Sanhedrin in Acts chapter 4. We have Stephen giving a very lengthy witness before the Sanhedrin in Acts chapter 7. We have Paul witnessing before the Roman governor Felix in Acts chapter 24. We have Paul witnessing before the Roman governor Festus and King Agrippa II in Acts chapter 26. And ultimately, according to Acts chapter 27, he went before and testified before the Emperor Nero. And so all that Jesus said here is going to give you an opportunity to testify. It has happened. It has happened. Verse 14, Complete Jewish Bible goes on. So, make up your minds not to worry, rehearsing your defense beforehand. Again, this is just like Matthew chapter 10, the instruction here. Beforehand, for I myself will give you an eloquence, or the New Living Translation says, I will give you the right words and a wisdom that no adversary will be able to resist or refute. So Jesus promised his servants that he would provide them the inspiration to properly and powerfully respond to the questioning to which they might be subjected. Don't worry about it. Through my Spirit, I'll give you the right words. Verse 16, you will be betrayed, even by parents and brothers, relatives and friends, and they will send some of you to your death. The persecution that would confront them would not be limited to the religious and civil authorities that he just mentioned right before this, but would come also from people who were close to them, as close as members of their own family. Now, this parallels the warning recorded by Matthew of offenses, of hatreds, and betrayals due to the love of many growing cold. So this will parallel that part of the Olivet prophecy that Matthew records. Verse 17, and you will be hated by all for my name's sake, or good speed, because you bear my name. Revised English Bible, for your allegiance to me. You're going to be hated by all. Now Matthew says, by all nations. By all nations. You'll be hated by all nations. So this verse summarizes all who hate the followers of Jesus from verses 12 and verse 16. And again, parallels Matthew 24, verse 9. Hated by all nations for my name's sake. Verse 18, Goodspeed has, yet not a hair of your head will perish. Jesus assures his disciples that God knows all, even the number of hairs on each one's head. Matthew chapter 10, verse 30. God's got them all numbered. And, you're losing hair every day. You're going to lose some hair. And God knows the number. This means that God is constantly aware of the state of his elect. He will never forget them. Won't forget anything about them if he keeps track of their hair. He's not going to forget anything. Not a thought. Not even a partial thought. He's not going to forget it. If they obey him, he will guide them through the times of persecution and bless them with deliverance, as he goes on to promise in verse 19. Verse 19 from the Complete Jewish Bible, by standing firm, you will save your lives. Now, this exhortation parallels Matthew 24, verse 13, where Jesus said there, he who endures to the end, the same shall be saved. What he says. Despite the accelerating growth of evil in the world, the disciples of Jesus must neither succumb to or allow it to distract them from the truth that they have been given, that's been apportioned to them by God. Those who obey this command that he gives here of standing firm in the truth, or standing firm in the faith, will receive the blessing of being saved from physical death by being protected through the hour of trial that will come on the whole world, that's given back here in Revelation chapter 3, verse 10. Because here in chapter 3, in addressing part of the final era, final group of God's people, final era being Laodicean, but there's the Philadelphia before, but we have individuals who live right up to that time that are a part of this, because they've repented of their Laodicean attitude and spirituality, and they're back to where they need to be with God. And we are told here in Revelation 3:10, because you have kept my command to persevere, he who endures to the end, he who stands firm to the end, will save your lives. Because you've kept my word to persevere, to endure patiently, I also will keep you. I'll protect you from the hour of trial which shall come upon the whole world to test those who dwell on the earth. So that's a promise to some, to those who remain faithful to God, who are allowed to live up to the very close of this age. And we will save the next verse for next time.